welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessikah. I am your host today, and I am here with the author of Endpapers, which is a really interesting story. So I am going to, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about Endpapers and what it's about, and we can go from there.
Sure, thank you. I guess first, though, I want to say thank you. Both for having me, but also just with everything going on in the country right now with book banning and that whole conservative effort, which is growing and growing. Just the work that libraries are doing is just incredible. Libraries and librarians. So
thank you. And yeah, it's disconcerting to say the least. Every time I see libraries trending on Twitter, I'm like, oh no. What is going to happen to us now? So it's like usually you want to be trending on Twitter, but when I see libraries trending on Twitter, I'm like, oh God, are we in trouble? Anyway, take it away.
Yeah.
Papers.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. And I don't know if Endpapers is ever going to be in that line of fire, but I am. So you said my name is Jennifer Savran Kelly, and Endpapers is my debut novel, and it is a book about a genderqueer bookbinder who works in the research library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a conservator. She's also an artist, a book artist. And in the book, we find her when she's really struggling with her relationship and with how her boyfriend is expecting her to present or wanting her to present, how she's presenting at work, and just how she's feeling about herself. It's 2003, so there's no mainstream they, them pronouns in use or words like non-binary. So she doesn't have a label for herself. And so she very early on discovers, as she's fixing a book at the Met, discovers underneath the end paper a torn off cover of a lesbian pulp novel from mid-century. And on the back of that torn off book cover is a letter written in German, and all she can tell is that it's a love letter and that it's written from one woman or girl to another. And so between the illustration on the cover of the book and the letter on the back, she sort of becomes a little bit obsessed with tracking down the person who wrote it, figuring, well, this was written in the 1950s, and let's see if this person ever got what they were looking for and if they had a good life. And she sort of feels like her identity and what she needs for her own life is sort of tied up in whatever story she might find out about this letter. And so that's sort of the inciting incident of the book, and it takes off from there.
Well, first of all, and because this is not video, I do have to let you know that Jennifer's cat is on screen, and I am in love with this cat. What is this cat's name?
This is Daffodil. We call her Daffy. And
Daffy!
You will see her a lot because it's almost time for her to eat, which means within the hour. So she starts early.
She's a little needy. Well, let's talk about the book. So first of all, I have to say, there's a lot I really loved about it. There's so many things about the topic that sort of checked my boxes. When I went into library science, and around the time that this book took place, I was just about wrapping up my master's. I went in like almost 6 months after I finished my undergrad. But one thing people might not know is I really wanted to work in the library of the Met.
Oh.
Yes, that was a dream job of mine. The Met is one of my favorite places. And, I went for archiving in library science. So I was like, one way or the other, I totally want to work at the Met. Obviously, that didn't happen, but I do go to the Met a lot. So there's that. But yeah, so that was one thing. Another thing is just, the whole concept of just gender identity, finding a love letter in a book. I have this in joke with my brother and some members of my family that my grandmother had, had a girlfriend back when she was 14 because my grandmother had this story about, and this was in the 20s. This woman, first she'd say, "Oh, I met this woman and she told me, she was a lesbian." And I was like, "Okay." And then like as the story went on, like years passed, and like then it would get more elaborate, like, "Oh, she brought me flowers." And then it's, "Oh, I was having lunch with her grandmother and it was her mother and her grandmother and it was the first non-kosher meal I ever had." And then, like, "Oh, like she knew your grandfather and she gave me a picture with a heart around it. Here it is." And my grandfather's sitting there like, "Yeah, she did." So one of the things about it is like, like thinking, like reading the synopsis and then thinking back to that, it's like, yeah, there, like, queer people existed
Absolutely.
before the Stonewall riots. Queer people existed before, there was queer media. And just because, like it was dangerous, for you to exist. And it made me amazed all the time that this woman was so open and so out to my grandmother, but also that my grandmother was like, "Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever, I'll take that. Yeah, sure." Um, it's a whole culture, I think, that people sweep under the rug. And just the idea that this woman who does this job, that I was like, yes, finds this queer love letter in a lesbian pulp. No, I was like, yeah, all of this, please. But another thing that I really like is that this Dawn's story takes place in 2003. And
Yeah.
there's a few things about that I find interesting. And I just, if you want to talk about it a little bit, why that particular setting, 2003 is post 9/11. And anybody who lived or worked or was anywhere near the city around that time, it was this really weird sense of quiet for like a few years, and the aftermath, it kept going for quite a while, and for some it's still going, but there was also no social media as we know it now. So
Right.
like, it's not like she could find this and then say, "I found this picture, can anybody, can anybody track this down?" So there were a lot of things about the story, that I thought was interesting. And I also loved Dawn's voice, and just the relationships and how it all worked out. So yeah, I guess if you want to talk a little bit about where the story came from, and sort of why you chose that setting.
Absolutely. The story came from a few places. The kernel came from actually a long time ago when I took my very first bookbinding workshop at the Center for Book Arts in New York, and had a wonderful instructor who would give us a little bit of a history lesson as she was teaching us how to bind books. And one day, very early on, she told us that sometimes bookbinders, when they were repairing books, would find personal letters hidden under the end papers of books. And I just thought that, and I've said this a million times now, but I feel like I found that to be so romantic and so tragic at the same time. And so the idea just stayed with me for many, many years, not in a way that I thought I would ever write a novel about it, but it was just something that kept sort of, coming up and coming up again. And, in the mid 2010s, there was a lot of political unrest, shall we say, in our country. And I am queer, and I'm genderqueer, and I'm bisexual. And I had been out and proud. I mean, the word genderqueer was not a thing, but I had dressed how I dressed and I had presented how I presented. And, my family and friends knew that I was bisexual through college. And then I married a heterosexual cisgender man. And I just sort of thought, okay, well, the queer community is not going to want to hear from me at all. The straight community is not going to want to hear anything about, the fact that I'm queer. And since it's not an issue, I'll just be quiet. And then again, in the mid 2010s, a lot of legislation being proposed against trans and LGBTQ folks. Violence was, rising and rising. And here I was just feeling like there was this huge side of me that most of the people in my life didn't know anything about anymore. And I felt really, really stuck, both personally and just socially. And I wanted to be an ally for the queer community, but I was afraid to speak out. And I thought, maybe it's time that I use my creative writing to try to find a voice to do this and tell a story. And I was really concerned about writing a novel about a social issue because I wanted it to be a story. I didn't want it to be an essay. I don't write nonfiction. So I did a lot of research. I looked around for personal stories, and the more I read, the more I kind of my own characters started coming into view, and I started to really see a story taking shape. And I set it in 2003 because, for a couple of reasons. One was that I knew sort of what I wanted the backstory to be almost before I knew what I wanted the present story to be. And I felt like this is probably a spoiler to anyone who hasn't read the book, but I really wanted the person who wrote the letter to be alive. And logistically, I needed to set it in a year where that was possible. And when I realized the possibilities for doing that around post 9/11, it really piqued my interest, because one of the things that I think we can all agree on, regardless of what side we're on, over the last 10 years or so, is that, what is reality, has really been called into question. And so politically, it's hard to find any common ground on anything because we're not even agreeing on facts. And so one of the things that really intrigued me about 9/11 is that even though conspiracy theories abound and people have all sorts of ideas about what they think happened, I think no one disagrees that it was a really fraught time. No one disagrees that there were groups that were being targeted after that happened. We have plenty of proof, we have plenty of evidence, and the people that do disagree, it's more of like a fringe, right? So I felt like it was really important to me to set the book in a time where at least we had some common understanding as a society of what that time meant. And despite the differences, again, not ignoring the huge differences there, but I felt like there was more common ground about that time than there is about the time we're living in now. And so I wanted to start there, because enough time has passed that people are not as emotionally invested in whatever side they have about that. So that really sparked my interest, was how do I, and then the same thing with the story that takes place from the 1950s and the Holocaust, which is mentioned as well, had that same sort of feeling to them. So that history, I felt like, gave the story more weight.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think, you do bring up a point that, really it was one of those times when people did sort of say, wow, that was terrible at the very least. And for sure, yeah, there were specific groups being targeted. And although I will say that that's probably one of the first times, man, maybe I was such a babe, but like certain things that came out of certain people's mouths, I was like, are you kidding?
Yeah.
Like, really? Um, and unfortunately, it just kept going from there. But yeah, no, I think it brings up a good point. And like I said, like once again, I think there's a lot of like things in this story that I like. It's got the book angle, and it's got gender and queerness, and it's but it's also kind of got like, I don't know, maybe like the child in me who loved From the Mixed Up Files of Ms. Basil Frankweiler likes the
Yeah.
idea of tracking people down and looking up old letters. There was so much richness in it,
Thank you.
and yeah, you're laughing. Were you thinking about that at all while you were writing it?
No, it's funny. I mean, I guess I'm laughing because after you've written something and read it over and over again, it starts to seem very simple to you. So just hearing you say richness is very nice. It's nice to hear.
Oh,
Thank
sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, but like I said before, I also think there's like, there's really something to be said. And I guess now it does seem so far off, especially to people who are now in their 20s. But the idea of not living in a world where everything is on social media, where, you can just track somebody down really easily, especially during the pandemic. I remember there was like some Twitter story, like some some woman met a friend in Hawaii and posted a picture of her, and she's like, she was my best friend for a night, and then we never saw each other again. And then suddenly the picture was shared enough, and that young woman came up on Twitter and had the same picture, like, but we don't have that. We didn't have that back in 2003. So, that's another reason why it sort of gives Dawn more room to grow and more room to feel the story out.
Right.
So the backstory with the 50s and, the Holocaust, how much research did you do? Did you do some, like oral history studies? Did you talk to certain people, who knew people in that time period?
No, I think for the Holocaust part, which ended up getting shortened for the book, but for good reason, I'm Jewish. And so I grew up hearing people come and talk to us. Survivors from the Holocaust would come to Temple and Hebrew school and they would talk to us. So I had heard people speak about that. And in terms of the 1950s, I really just did a lot of research on the sort of confluence of two things that were happening around the same time that really interested me. One was the Lavender Scare, which I had heard of in a very basic way, but I had never known the extent
Oh,
what was
100%,
going on.
100%, 100%. And first of
Yeah.
all, I will say also, yeah, I know there's a Holocaust Remembrance Center around here, and they send people to school still, um, which, there's not a lot of first person narratives left, which
Yeah.
there's a lot of things you can say about that, but as far as, keeping, like, remembering what happened and being like, listen, this is something we really need to acknowledge so it never ever ever happens again. Yeah. But as far as the Lavender Scare goes, oh my God, one of the things that kills me about that is, I remember in one of my feminism classes reading like The Feminine Mystique and being like, yeah, Betty Friedan. And then you're just like, you hear a little bit more about her views on lesbianism, and you're just like, oh, Betty, what?
Yeah.
Did
It
you want
was
to talk a little bit about that then?
it was a scary time, people were, and I didn't know the extent to what was going on during the Lavender Scare. And because, we learn about, well, in history class, I didn't learn about the Lavender Scare, what's been going on in the government itself. A lot of the documents were destroyed, which I learned in my research as well. So we don't actually have a lot of documents left from that time. And it was heavily supported by the FBI. And so basically what was going on was that anyone who was found to be gay or suspected of it could be purged and would be purged from government employment, federal employment. And at first you hear that and you think, oh, they're losing government jobs, they can just go work elsewhere. But then when you dig deeper, it's like, well, if you're a teacher, you're a federal employee. If you're, there are so many jobs that this covers. And so you can't just go move to another state, get another job, right? So like, if this is what you're trained to do, this is your job. If it's your livelihood, you're ruined. And so people were committing suicide. And what was happening was, if somebody was suspected, they were surveilling people in secret. They were keeping secret files. They were holding trials where the person accused wasn't allowed to testify. So, the tactics being used were like horrible. And then it would just be decided, without any real proof that so-and-so is gay or is suspected of being gay because they came out of, a bathroom with someone who was gay, for example, a public restroom. So it was that bad. And then you would lose your job. And the whole way that the government spun it was that, gay people were obviously sick, their minds were twisted, and therefore they could be easily manipulated by communists. And it was during the Red Scare, but it lasted longer than the Red Scare, which again is another thing that I didn't realize was how long the Lavender Scare lasted. So it really ruined a lot of people's lives. And so you can imagine how anyone who was in the public eye, writers, philosophers, whoever, to speak out, or not to speak out against homosexuality could be very dangerous. So, one of the things that I had heard said to me when I came out by well-meaning people who were trying to, say that they accepted me was, I'm worried about your son and your son's safety, and maybe it's not a good idea to come out. And it's like, well, So, and again, there's a generational idea, not that we are safe now. I don't want to, imply that we are entirely safe now either, but it is a different world. And so I think that it was just a very, very dangerous time for anyone to come out or support homosexuality.
And I just want to kind of what's the word? I want to just amend myself really quickly. Actually, so the Lavender Menace, which sort of was born from the Lavender Scare, actually that's more late 60s, early 70s. But Betty Friedan, who is known to have written The Feminine Mystique and is like one of the mothers of, is it second wave feminism, third wave feminism? The Lavender Menace was something she would talk about very passionately, because she, who was, I believe, what was it? She was the president of the National Organization for Women, believed that lesbianism posed a threat to women. And like, so again, like, obviously the name Lavender Menace was born out, it did last a lot longer and had a lot more twisty turny tentacles out there. But I remember when I first heard about that, I was like, but in my feminism classes, we
Right.
heard that Betty Friedan was on the up and up. What the heck? Yeah, no, you do bring forward, something, because you do hear a lot about the Red Scare, and you do hear a lot about those trials. But like, even like when the fabric of your being is kind of called into question, and like I think it was very recently that homosexuality was removed as like a from medical texts, certain medical texts, as like a mental illness. I mean, it's crazy when you really think about it, that aside from the fact that it ever was, but just like how recently this all happened.
Yeah, well, in 2003, another thing about setting the book in that time is that Massachusetts was legalizing gay marriage, and George W. Bush was trying to pass his Defense of Marriage Act so that on a federal level, gay marriage would be banned. And so that whole discussion was also happening in 2003, which I thought was an interesting background for Dawn's journey as a queer person too. So. And then along with the Lavender Scare, that other issue in history that was happening around the same time, near when the Lavender Scare first started, was when the gay pulp novel was invented. And so that was a really interesting crossover as well, because, and that just had to do with, the technology, because suddenly books were so easy and cheap to make. If you wanted to make these little paperbacks, you could mass produce them and sell them for practically nothing. So suddenly everyone could buy books, and people wanted everything. They wanted murder mysteries. They wanted, all these things that before were considered to be very unsavory and that people shouldn't be reading. Suddenly everyone wanted them. So the publishers just kept making them, and they saw a window for the queer pulp novel in there. But in order for it to be allowed to ever leave the bindery and get onto store shelves, it had to make it look like it was a terrible, terrible life choice. And so it was always had terrible endings. And so, those books are not like the standard of the queer stories that we should be telling. But at the same time, for people who were too young to go out to a gay bar, or who didn't have access to that for whatever reason, people found each other through reading these pulp novels and imagining themselves, having some sort of life. And they began to organize. And so I thought it was really interesting that at the same time as the Lavender Scare, there was this other almost movement, happening around queer pulp fiction. So those were the areas that I really dug into when I was writing.
Did you find any queer pulp fiction that you really enjoyed? Like anything that you would recommend for someone to track down?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think any of them, they're all kind of the same. I mean, I just enjoyed reading bits and pieces of them. I actually get another spoiler, but I got to try my hand at writing when there's an excerpt in the book that I totally made up. So they're fun. I don't think I would enjoy reading a whole one myself, but I read lots and lots of pieces of them just to see like what the style felt like and what kinds of scenes were in there and how some of them ended. And Yeah, I don't think that there are any that I would say, yeah, go out and read. But I think if you were to pick any of them up, you would probably find very similar, very melodramatic, lots of double crossing and, lots of big feelings and drugs,
Yeah,
violence.
yeah. I mean, it is very interesting that they had to that they did sort of, they made them, and then it's like, oh, but if you don't do it because it's gonna end horribly. So like, here's your meal, and here's your after dinner mint, and you have indigestion. So
Yeah.
don't do it. Don't do it. Um, but I mean, again, like there's so much here, and do you want to? Would you write something else after this? How long did it take you to write this?
Yeah, it took me a couple of years, starting and stopping and working, leaving to go work on other projects, and then revising and revising and revising some more. So it was years of writing, and I do have other projects that I've written sort of alongside this one that I'm wrapping up now, and ideas for other things I want to do. Yeah, I mean, I've been writing for a long time, even though this is the first book I'm publishing. So I feel like I've got things going and things I want to do, and just hope I have enough time and in my life, to do them all. Yeah.
Well, this has been super, super fun. I think people are really going to like it. Like I said, I don't want to take people on the journey because I think they should go on it themselves. But there's just like, it's just sort of this beautiful mosaic of so many different things and big feelings, and it captures the moment, and it captures just sort of possibilities, I suppose, of the future, of the past. And yeah, it was really, really cool. Thank you for sharing it with us and for chatting with me.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I just want to leave on the note that it is a difficult story, and I feel like we touched on a lot of those difficult things in the conversation, but I also hope that it's infused with some hope, and that is what ultimately people take away from the parts of the journey that are difficult, and the growth that I hope
Yeah.
can be seen throughout in the characters. So I do definitely don't want to give the wrong idea that it's not a difficult story, but it's also a hopeful story. So
I found it to be very hopeful myself. Your
good.
cat is hoping for food, though. I see that.
Yes. She's always hopeful.
Well, once again, this is Jessikah with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest today was
Jennifer Savran Kelly.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.